My name is Christine Ockrent. I'm a journalist based in Paris, and I have the pleasure to try and moderate this very impressive panel, starting with Charles Powell, Max Bergmann, Erik Brattberg, and Ian Lester. And we will discuss how to renovate the transatlantic partnership to fit the increasingly multipolar world. Well, it seems to me the Atlantic Partnership has indeed been revived in the worst possible way, that is to say, a war on our continent, but it has shown indeed not only the resilience, but the necessity of this alliance to protect its European members from any further Russian aggression. And also, it shows that the war and also the enlargement to Sweden and Finland show how indeed vibrant this alliance has become. I remember a time where Emmanuel Macron, in one of his inspired moments, told The Economist, that was about 2.5 years ago, that indeed NATO was in the case of a mort cerebrale. How would you translate that?
Brain dead.
Brain dead. Brain dead. Well, it hasn't been that way, and indeed, to be fair, the French president has recognized that. So I suggest we first try and ask ourselves to what extent this extraordinary unity, which the alliance has shown throughout the 14 months or so of this war, to what extent can it indeed last and endure? Because there will be a moment where the goals of the war will have to be spelled out by the NATO members. Mr. Stoltenberg was in Kiev last week. I think it was the first time he actually went there. And he did say, of course, that Ukraine has to win this war. Now, let me start with you, Ian. To what extent we all agree Ukraine has to win, but on what conditions eventually we now see Beijing getting into the game, offering its sort of a mediation, so to speak. Is there any risk that indeed the NATO unity might fracture when it comes to deciding should we or should we not ask our Ukrainian friends to negotiate?
Christine, thank you very much. You know, obviously there's been this tremendous renaissance of at least the security side of the relationship as a result of the war. And, you know, it's absolutely true that something like 90% of what is being given to Ukraine that's allowed them to do this well has been sent by the United States, and probably much of the rest has been brought there by the United States. So it's absolutely, you know, the complacency is gone about the security element of this. I think, you know, there's tremendous lack of clarity about what kind of war termination would look like in Ukraine. And there is the potential for, you know, cohesion eroding over that issue. I think there are many more things. We're assuming that this conflict simply continues in a linear fashion. But the truth is there are a lot of things that could still go very, very wrong, including, you know, very serious escalation that would implicate NATO in a much more direct way. So, you know, you're asking the right question, but, you know, I am also very struck, and we could continue on this. I won't say too much about it, but, you know, you have this enormous focus on the importance of the security dimension of the relationship and the U.S. commitment to Europe in defense. At the same time, you have all sorts of disputes about trade and regulation and digital affairs and the IRA, and, you know, and I can't see that going away either, you know, if you allow me, because, you know, the state is back. Industrial policy is back. All of these things are back. So I think if you're looking for a formula, you'll probably come to it in the end of the conversation about how you assure the viability of the relationship. It's not just about war termination in Ukraine or the NATO dimension, which is important, but also about how we reconcile that with this growing tension over the political economy of the relationship.
Max, would you pick up on
Yeah,
that?
well, I think this has been a seminal year in transatlantic relations. It is clear the importance of the NATO alliance, the importance of transatlantic cooperation. I do think that we also are in a bit of a moment where we have a very transatlanticist president in the United States, who just announced that he's going to run again and may be reelected, but he may not be. And I think this could be a fleeting moment of transatlantic unity and cooperation. I also think that in Washington, you definitely feel the pull of the Asia pivot is very strong. And what we saw over the last year was essentially the focus of the administration, the focus of the national security bureaucracy, the focus of a lot of resources going toward Europe. And I don't necessarily see that as being sustainable over the long run, and you can already sort of feel the pull toward the Indo-Pacific and real trade-offs having to be made within the Pentagon, for instance. If you're going to allocate equipment to Europe and forces to Europe, then what are you not allocating to the Indo-Pacific? And so I think the debates and fights that we've had over the decades over defense spending and burden sharing, I think will be rekindled, as well as some of the economic issues and challenges. The one thing I would just say on the economic and climate issues, I do think this administration, for instance, has really recognized the importance of trying to work with Europe and forge kind of transatlantic cooperation when it comes to economic and climate issues. That didn't really play out over the Inflation Reduction Act, largely because of how our congressional bills are written. But the whole creation of a EU-US Trade and Tech Council was, I think, fundamentally about China, was fundamentally the administration recognizing that to deal with China, you had to get on the same page with Europe. And I don't think we're seeing enough progress there, but I think that is an area where strategically in the future, that is kind of where the United States and Europe will really need to work together. And I think there's in the strategic interest of the United States to really pursue that. And finally, when it comes to defense spending, that's going to be a fight that is ongoing. And the point I'd make is that when there's right now a debate at the EU on the Stability and Growth Pact and trying to limit budget deficits, well, if that happens and Christian Lindner gets his way in Germany, I don't see how is Spain going to hit 2% of defense spending? How is Spain going to increase defense spending, or any other European country that's heavily indebted? And I think that has real potential implications, and we don't really sync up the EU-NATO conversation enough, and we don't think about it that way in Washington either, which is a problem.
The problem with debt, as you know very well in Washington, D.C., is that you can increase the debt.
Yes.
And that may indeed include more defense spending. Charles, as you are based in Madrid, as I understand it, a more European point of view about this dilemma of the European members of the alliance vis-à-vis what has become indeed, for all sorts of reasons, the China obsession with our American friends. How should or how do European members of the alliance, in your view, adjust to this new, rather new focus of American interests?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Before I answer, since you started your introductory remarks mentioning the wonderful Emmanuel Macron, Macron bashing is a wonderful sport. I indulge in it myself quite often. But back in 2019, when he said NATO was brain dead, you know what? It was brain dead. My institute co-hosted the NATO Public Forum in Madrid in June of last year. And before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we really didn't know what the point of the NATO summit was really going to be. Stoltenberg was telling us that we had to talk about the climate change security nexus. So we were going to spend most of our energy talking about climate change. From a NATO perspective, are you serious? It was a very frustrating position to be in. So thanks to Mr. Putin, suddenly we have regained focus. Having said that, to answer your question, I think the EU basically faces two major dilemmas. The first is how to redefine its relationship with the United States at a time when we all know that without US military support, Ukraine would be overrun in a matter of weeks. And we don't really have a good answer to that. And of course, the main problem is that we are more dependent on the US than ever, precisely at a time when we were trying to develop some sort of viable European strategic autonomy concept. I think the only honest answer to this dilemma is that we have to develop a European defense pillar, not in juxtaposition with the US or with NATO, but precisely to strengthen NATO. I know this is said so often that people doubt the veracity of the statement, but I do really believe that stronger EU capabilities would benefit both the EU and NATO. The other dilemma, as you pointed out, is China. I think the key thing to point out here, as Monsieur Macron did in his rather unfortunate, admittedly, interview in Les Echos, is, first of all, we have to recognize that the EU's interests and those of the United States are similar but not identical. And I think this is a legitimate point for Europeans to make. However, what was totally missing in Macron's statement was this. There is a clear military and geopolitical link between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. In other words, between Ukraine and Taiwan. What was actually quite offensive about Macron's statement was that he was washing his hands of the Taiwan business completely. His message was business as usual, business first, at a time when the Chinese were harassing Taiwan more than ever. So how do we respond to that dilemma? Remember, by the way, that because of the war, the US has to some extent pivoted back to Europe. Troop presence has increased from 65,000 to about 100,000. So I think we need to, precisely because we're not on the same page, precisely because our interests are not identical, we Europeans need to coordinate very closely with America on China policy. There are several things we could do. You mentioned the EU-US Trade and Tech Council. That isn't working. Maybe we need a geo-economic NATO, a structure where we can talk to our American partners about the geo-economic consequences of the geopolitical changes that are taking place. Additionally, for example, European troops could replace some of the American troops that are being sent to places like Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. I raised this in Helsinki the other day, by the way, and didn't get a very warm reception. A lot of the Finns said, we'd rather have American troops, if you don't mind. But maybe there is no alternative to that. Finally, why not a European nuclear deterrent? Let's encourage Monsieur Macron to put his money where his mouth is. That is really the supreme test of strategic autonomy. Let's have a European nuclear deterrent. The point ultimately, though, is that our relationship with the US has grown increasingly imbalanced. The economic, technological, and military gap is bigger than ever. And I think we run a real risk of being irrelevant in the eyes of the United States. Thank you.
Erik, to that very good point about a necessary geo-economic approach to the transatlantic issues, this administration, for all sorts of reasons, and it will obviously need to show results with the presidential campaign shaping up, the protectionist agenda that the Biden administration has put in place, the first ones that are hit are us, your very good allies. So, and it is true that a few key European countries are indeed increasing their defense spending. Therefore, burden sharing is a little bit more balanced, or will eventually be when Germany eventually spends the money that has been announced. So how do you view this sort of growing concern about, okay, we're very much in tune when it comes to defense issues, but less and less so when it comes to trade issues?
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's not just an issue for Europe. I think it's an issue that a lot of US allies have with this growing sense of protectionism, where I think there's a bit of a disconnect between a strong focus on allies and partners on security issues, defense issues, in NATO, in the Indo-Pacific, but this kind of protectionist focus when it comes to economic issues. And for Europe, this is a great challenge. We've already seen the impacts of the IRA in terms of limiting European companies' ability to sell to the US market. I think we're also continuing to see the US exerting its economic security tools to address China in ways that will have effects on European companies. And here there's a real need to work together on this. Within the TPC, maybe within other formats, within the G7, economic security is going to be top of the agenda in Japan next month. And here's where we need really strong cooperation transatlantically and with other like-minded partners on this. Europe is beginning to discuss this, and we heard from President von der Leyen talking about de-risking instead of decoupling. Europe is beginning to think about how to, having already developed its tools for trade defense against China in recent years with things like investment screening and 5G, anti-coercion, it is now beginning to think about outbound investment screening, export controls for critical technologies, limiting those from being exported to China. This needs to be done very much linked up with the United States and with other partners like Japan, Australia, and others. Working together on critical minerals, I think, is going to be absolutely crucial. We all need this collectively. And rather than competing, rather than competing between ourselves, we should work together on this, offering credible, attractive alternatives to countries in Africa or Latin America who wants to export these resources. So I think there's an opportunity to reinvent, to the question about the topic for this panel, reinvent the transatlantic relationship, working together on these industrial policy, economic security issues, rather than having it be something that ultimately divides us. But I am concerned that there is growing protectionism on the US side, but also on the European sides with some initiatives on the tech regulatory side or on CBAM, carbon border adjustment tax, that could also have a negative impact on the transatlantic relationship.
Ian Lester, when it comes to China, Chancellor Scholz, as I understand it, is about to organize a sort of German-China summit. So far, as much as I know, without any European Commission or any other EU member participation. We also heard with great applause the German foreign minister in Beijing having a very, very firm speech about China not respecting trade agreements, of course human rights and so on and so forth. But the same day Volkswagen announced investment, 1 million euros in China. So there is a moment where within the EU, the China issue will become more and more difficult.
Well, there's no question about this. I mean, I think in all the sessions, almost all the sessions I've been in here in Delphi so far, this issue has been addressed with understandable roots. There's real substance to this. I think it's clear that in the United States there is a very hawkish consensus. There are not many things that Republicans and Democrats agree on these days in Washington. This is one of them. But I would also say, sitting in Brussels, that there has been a very marked hardening of European attitudes towards China on many levels. Now, the private sector, of course, also makes its own decisions. There was some reference earlier to the effect of the IRA on business across the Atlantic. In fact, the truth is that for some years now, European companies in many sectors have been investing and moving their production to the United States because there were many reasons to do so. So, I think it's not always the case that the official discourse on some of these issues, whether it's on trade or it's on China, will necessarily compel the private sector to follow. And so this question that you raise about how you reconcile the strategic, the security with the economic is never going to be an easy one, not just because these are different issue spaces, because they're different actors. But I would say that you also have a very unusual window at the moment in this administration in Washington, because it's an administration that is not only Atlanticist in its formation, but also takes the European Union seriously as an institution. And you know, we mustn't forget also that we're talking about people who make these decisions and do this. There's a very close relationship, apparently, between President von der Leyen and President Biden. And these things matter, actually, at the end of the day. And so I think, you know, you also need to talk in terms of possible political shifts on both sides and what effect that would be. But I think there is a hardening of attitudes on China. It's just it's going faster and further in the United States than it has in Europe.
Charles, let's get back to this very, very interesting concept, which I believe, and I just heard you do as well, there's very much a need for European sovereignty, European strategic autonomy, whatever way you want to, whichever wording you want to use. It is, aside from the war in Ukraine, which makes it pretty obvious, what would be the incentives when it comes to what is now called the Global South? I think it has been a shock to many of us to realize that indeed the war in Ukraine looks irrelevant to a large majority of countries and people in the world. And it is, of course, the opportunity for Xi Jinping to actually propose an alternative world order, as he puts it. Can there be a European answer to such a huge challenge when we see that our own democracies, for all sorts of reasons, are beginning to doubt about their own values?
Again, I think this is one of the areas where we have to stress that our interests with the United States are similar but not identical. Let's see. I think there's a bit of hysteria in Washington and perhaps in Brussels as well about losing the Global South, right? There was a very good article in The Economist recently which reminded us that only 52 countries in the world are imposing sanctions on Russia. 127 are sitting on the fence. Those 127 represent 45% of world GDP, 45% of the world's population, and about 18% of the world's GDP. Now, why are these countries sitting on the fence? And by the way, this article specifically centered on the so-called transactional 25, which are some of the biggest economies in the world, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Brazil, and so on. I think this sort of West versus the rest narrative, which originated in the United States, obviously, is not good for the European Union. You know, we don't see the world exactly in those terms, I think. And therefore, you know, we need to engage with the Global South much more effectively than we're doing, both through trade mechanisms and also politically. Trade mechanisms. During the second semester of this year, Spain will hold the presidency of the Council of the EU. We signed an agreement with Mercosur in 2019. It hasn't been ratified. Now that Lula is back in power in Brazil, there is a real opportunity for ratification. This joint market between Europe and Latin America consists of 800 million people, and it's 25% of world GDP. I think this is the kind of thing we need to do. Additionally, the EU doesn't have free trade agreements with New Zealand, with Australia, with India, and with most ASEAN countries. Let's play to our strengths. What is the biggest EU strength? The internal market. We are not a military superpower. We will never be a military superpower. Maybe we're no longer the civilian superpower or the normative power that we used to think we were, but at least we still have the most attractive internal market, the strongest trading bloc in the world. So I think we need to play to our strengths.
Erik, there has been a second summit of democracies in Washington a few weeks ago. The first one wasn't that much of a success, but nevertheless, there has been a second one. And of course, with, I believe, the South Korean president being very much the guest of honor. Is there any disappointment in Washington, D.C. or in the administration to see that this kind of ideological approach to the issues of democracies as a bloc, we Europeans find it a little bit uncomfortable?
I think even in Washington, I think there's been a little bit less focus on the sort of stark difference between democracy versus authoritarianism that you maybe saw early in the administration. I think that still is an important theme, but I think there's also recognition that we don't want to exclude countries, that we need to bring on countries, especially for managing the Ukraine war together. And I think, the goal with the Summit for Democracy was never really to just say that we are democracies and you guys are not. It was really to kind of try to bolster democracy within our societies, and that's what the intent of the summit was, and having countries commit to things, practical things that they can do internally to strengthen democracy. But I think Charles brings up a good point. It's not enough to go to the global south, if you will, and lecture them and just say you need to get on the board with Ukraine or whatever it might be. We need to offer real serious alternatives. Free trade is part of that, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think offering investments in the form of the type of things that China's been doing with the Belt and Road, where we have some emerging policies. The EU has the Global Gateway, the G7 has the Project for Global Infrastructure. That's a start, but it's not, I think, the full picture. Another thing where we should be much more forward-leaning is on global development finance reform. This is something that Global South countries are asking for, to have greater financing opportunities from the Bretton Woods institutions. We should lean into this. This would be an attractive offer that would help, bring countries, away from kind of the China sphere, if you will, into the other camps. I think we need to recognize our own shortcomings and be far more ambitious rather than just trying to respond with rhetoric about democracy.
Max, with the presidential campaign, which unfortunately promises to be yet, even more violent and in such a fractured American society, what will the Ukraine war, what will be all those issues, what role will they play in the campaign? Do you see a kind of competition to use such arguments, or rather, as usual, try and stay away from them?
So I think sometimes foreign policy is overstated as an issue in our presidential campaigns. I do think we're already seeing some of the challenges of continuing to provide or continuing to maintain our level of support for Ukraine. I think to really understand what's happened over the last year is that Congress has just allocated, to their credit, a massive amount of funding, so $50 billion, above the Pentagon's budget that is just sort of extra spending for Ukraine. What needs to happen now is the administration will soon run out of money. They will need to go back to Congress. They will need to get an appropriation from Congress. Congress obviously changed with our midterm election in last November, and it's not quite clear where or how that money is going to materialize. The administration's been very positive, trying to reassure our European friends that our support will be there, and there are ways we can figure out ways to reallocate funding, but it'll become harder for the United States. And that's one of the things that I think we're seeing with our political cycle, where there's not universal Republican support in the House for support for Ukraine, even though there's probably 85% of the House would support additional funding for Ukraine. The Speaker of the House has to bring forward legislation. So I do think it's going to complicate our ability to maintain the unprecedented level of military support. And while there's been criticism of how some equipment should get there faster, having worked that portfolio when I was in government, I can tell you what's happening is utterly unprecedented. Now, no one should be sleeping. Everyone should be working 24 hours a day, and I think some of that's happening. But the level of support has been really unfathomable. What is not happening, though, and this is, I think, Undersecretary of Defense Colin Kahl said this quite articulately, that the planning is about what's happening right in front of us, what's happening with the Ukrainian counteroffensive. How do we get some stuff to Ukraine right now for what they need right now? But what about 2024? What about the tanks that we provide now when they get destroyed? And that's where, wars are really stupid because they are incredibly costly and they require a ton of money. And the way the United States paid for our wars over the last 20 years is not by taking money out of our defense budget, but by allocating additional funding. And I think it's incumbent on Europe to also look at other ways to support the war effort in Ukraine. Because maybe just a final point, when we talk about the Global South, I think the most important thing for the Global South when it comes to Ukraine and Russia is for Ukraine to be successful and for Russia to essentially have a strategic defeat. And if that happens, we will have demonstrated that simply through our economic and military support that we can bring a global military power to its knees. And I think that will be a real demonstration of the strength of Europe, the United States, of the quote-unquote West.
Ian, would you
No, I just
subscribe
wanted
to
to,
that?
thank you. I just wanted to pick up on this last point about the Global South, which has been mentioned a number of different times. I think actually that the notion of a real split between, let's say, the sort of Euro-Atlantic consensus around Ukraine and the Global South is in some sense overdone. I know that's a slightly eccentric view, but I think it is. I think when it comes to legality, when it comes to morality, countries like India, South Africa, Brazil are more or less aligned with the European and American approach. Where it falls apart is on a practical level on sanctions, where interests collide with this and people are just not on board. And when it comes to this notion of a broader looming confrontation ideologically between autocracy and democracy, which many people in the Global South just aren't buying. And so my sense is that in Washington, maybe less so in Brussels, I'm not sure, there is some understanding that you just cannot expect India, Brazil, South Africa, et cetera, to line up precisely on this issue or indeed other issues that may come in the future. China is another one, of course, for the Global South. So, I think part of, what we might think about in terms of transatlantic relations is not only, sure, the center of gravity is between the United States and Europe, but what happened to the rest of the Atlantic? There's a big space there that we've not engaged, at least in terms of transatlantic
You're talking
relations.
about the UK?
No, actually. I'm thinking, they're obviously
Supposed to
part
be
of this.
joint.
I'm thinking about Brazil. I'm thinking about West Africa. I'm thinking about all of these places where we're concerned about the competition with China and what Russia is doing in other places. This should be part of the transatlantic discourse too, and we should think of ways to do that, it seems to me. It would pay dividends.
Could I just point out,
Please.
after more than a year at war, Zelensky has only been invited to address 2 Latin American parliaments, Chile and most recently Mexico. In many other parliaments, this was raised and voted down, okay? So I agree with Ian in the sense that things aren't perhaps as black and white, as clear-cut as they might seem, but this has to be acknowledged. I think the important point is, again, going back to these countries which are sitting on the fence, they're undecided, or they simply don't want to take sides, with very good reason. We wax lyrical about the rules-based international order, but in a lot of these countries, people will say, what did the rules-based international order ever do for us? We have to keep that into account.
And that's very much, of course, the consensus which Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are trying to use, sort of anti-imperialist, colonialist, all these arguments, which indeed are very well played out to that kind of an audience. We have just a few minutes left, so I will just ask each of you, what would be, in a very few words, the best news for this transatlantic system to keep on working as well as possible? Ian,
Okay,
let me
I'm
start with
probably going
you.
to steal the answer from a number of my colleagues, I suspect. I think, a reasonable and predictable result from the next American presidential election would probably help.
Yeah.
Well, I think That's a good answer from Ian. I mean, I think what I would say is what has been the thorn in the side of transatlantic relations and the issue that is oftentimes just dominated, which is European defense spending. And I think it's very one of the things that we've learned from this war is that the state of European militaries are actually in worse shape than we even thought. And so there's going to need to be a lot of European investment. And I think that would lead to European strategic autonomy, which would actually be beneficial to, I think, both the US, Europe, and the transatlantic relationship.
Erik?
I think we need to get our approaches to industrial policy lined up. I think we're seeing, again, the US embarking on the IRA. We're seeing similar discussions in Europe around the net zero industrial plan, CHIPS Act, and so on and so forth. This needs to be joined up. We need to have a joint transatlantic approach to industrial policy for technology, for clean energy, and I think that's a huge opportunity at the end of the day. So I think we should embrace that, but that requires coordination. It requires working together and having the right formats for doing so, but also the political will to actually make tough decisions that politically may not always be popular, but ultimately makes together the transatlantic community more competitive vis-a-vis China rather than just competing against each other.
Charles?
I would like to see the EU taking open strategic autonomy seriously. In other words, not just the defense and security dimension, but essentially the industrial, technological, and innovation dimension. That, I think, is the only way, first of all, of beginning to close the gap between the EU and the United States, but also of being able to do this in a coordinated manner.
And you believe there's enough incentive within the 27 to achieve such a goal?
I think the combination of the pandemic and the war have provided sufficient incentives. Remember that during the pandemic, we woke up and discovered that we didn't even produce enough paracetamol, let alone, protective equipment for our doctors and nurses. I think the writing is on the wall for us. We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
Well, thank you very much to you four. We're giving the floor 50 seconds ahead. I think it's quite an achievement here in Delphi. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.